It took me a while, and I think it took a lot of us a while on that day to believe it. I remember while I was doing news reporting, at one point I was sort of back and forth from different locations, and I went back to my house in Brooklyn and climbed up on the roof just to be sure. Because even in the middle of reporting it, I couldn't actually believe that the Twin Towers had collapsed.
From the 9/11 Memorial Museum, this is Our City, Our Story, a series where New Yorkers talk about their city and how September 11th changed that. I'm Will Thwaites. Andrea Bernstein is the senior editor for politics and policy at New York City's public radio station, WNYC.
Yeah, can you hear everything?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
okay.
That's where my co-host Jenny Pachuki sat down to interview her.
I'm envious of all your fancy equipment.
I'm envious of this room. They only let us in here on special occasions.
Bernstein joined WNYC's team in 1996. Since then, she's won a Knight Fellowship, a Peabody Award, plus over 40 other accolades for her journalism. And a lot of Bernstein's work has revolved around New York City, its government, its politics, its transportation. But even before she started reporting on it, Bernstein seems to have had some combination of a fascination and a frustration with this city.
Did you have a moment where you remember that you thought of yourself as a New Yorker?
Well, I thought of myself as a New Yorker, I think, before I moved here. So after I finished college, I came to visit New York. My grandmother at the time was living on the East Side then, and I went to visit her, and I stayed in her house, and that is the moment where I said to myself, I'm a New Yorker, I should be living in this city, and then I moved here.
What were your impressions of the city, and how did you begin to develop a relationship with the city?
So that was the 80s, right? New York was really at that time still living with the Ford to Big Apple drop dead headline. The transit system was on the brink of not functioning. There were thousands of homicides a year, and it was a whole lot cheaper. I lived in a 6th floor walk-up on East 65th Street. Rent was $400 a month.
Oh, man.
A bathtub in the kitchen. So that was what New York was like then.
Okay, so I haven't lived in New York City that long, but still, I consider myself a New Yorker. And yet there's this different class of New Yorker that's old school. They've had as many decades here as I've had years. And with that comes a totally different collection of memories, one of which, unfortunately, is the first time the Twin Towers were attacked.
Do you remember the first bombing of the World Trade Center?
I do remember. It was a February day. It was kind of gray and raw, and we went over there to survey what was going on. Of course, it was nothing like what was to come, but I remember it, and I remember how there was a story in New York Newsday, the late, great New York Newsday, about the people who had rented the van, and that ended up cracking the news of that story. So I remember that well.
Did it ever occur to you at the time that this would happen again here?
No. I mean, I think it was 6 people died then. Was that right? 6 people died. That's horrible. But it was nothing like what happened. And so even if I thought that was going to happen again, I think it was unimaginable that what did happen was going to happen. And as a matter of fact, it took me a while, and I think it took a lot of us a while on that day to believe it. I remember while I was doing news reporting, at one point I was sort of back and forth from different locations, and I went back to my house in Brooklyn and climbed up on the roof just to be sure. Because even in the middle of reporting it, I couldn't actually believe that the Twin Towers had collapsed.
How did that morning start for you?
So that was primary day in New York, and I had been covering the mayoral election. It was expected on that day that the winner of the Democratic primary was going to be the next mayor. So I knew it was going to be a late night. I planned to go in around 4 so that I would be working a late shift. So I wasn't going to work. I had planned to go to the gym and get a pedicure, and I was taking my daughter to pre-K, And we were sort of moseying around at the house, and I heard in rapid succession the report that a plane had hit the World Trade Center.
There has been some sort of an incident at the World Trade Center, and it involves an apparent accident involving an airplane of some type.
Probably like 8 million other people in New York, when they first heard that, I thought it was a Cessna. And I was like, that was a stupid pilot. And then I got a call from my editor saying, we need you to go down to the World Trade Center. And I remember looking down at my sand little feet thinking, I'm not going to get a pedicure today. And then whisking my daughter into the car so I could drop her off at then daycare. And she said to me, why are we going in the car? Because her daycare center was something like 6 blocks away. And I said, because a plane hit a building and I have to go find out why. As I was driving back to try and park the car, as I was looking for a spot, I heard a second report on WNYC, and this was from Patricia Willems, who is still here as an editor here, who lived near the World Trade Center towers, and she was giving an eyewitness report of what was happening.
Patricia, why were you in the area? Did you go down there once you heard of this, or were you in the vicinity?
No, I live here, and I was here in my home, and I heard an airplane flying low over my building, and I remarked upon it, and then there was an explosion. I ran to the window and saw it immediately after its impact.
And I realized, oh shoot, this is not a Cessna. So I walked to the Brooklyn Bridge, which was about as far as I got that day, and watched streams of people coming over, and they were covered in ash, and they were telling stories. I mean, you asked me, did I think it was going to happen again? The stories they were telling, it was hard for the mind to process, because they were talking about people jumping out of the windows of the World Trade Center from the very highest floors. And obviously, we know now that that happened. But at the time, to think something like that would actually happen in your own city, not in a disaster movie, was almost incomprehensible. But because I'm a journalist, there was no other choice to do but to continue to talk to people, continue to call into the station. And for most of that day, I was stationed at the Brooklyn Bridge.
Were you ever concerned about your own safety? You're standing next to a landmark, and landmarks are being attacked.
You know, this is a crazy thing about being a journalist, which I think is hard for other people to understand, and it's hard for me to understand. We run towards the things that other people are running away from. That is our instinct, and it is a crazy instinct, but it's just what we do by training. So if something is happening, even something horrible, our instinct was to run towards it.
Because they ran towards the chaos, journalists like Bernstein found themselves in the events of September 11th, instead of watching or listening to them.
My experience of 9/11 was so different because I was there. So you often hear, we all saw on TV, but I didn't see 9/11 on TV. I did not experience it the way that the rest of America did. I think it was Tom Tomorrow was one of the cartoonists who said, look, the Twin Towers are the same size as Dan Rather's head. And for me, I didn't have that experience. So I, in some ways, don't know what the rest of America experienced because I experienced it being here. And I did not get to have the distancing effect of it having been on television. One of the other things that was different from my life, that was different from other people's lives, is that I covered for 5-6 years the rebuilding. So I went to so many meetings of the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation and so many press conferences with the family. And each time I would go to one of these press conferences or one of these meetings, there would be family members. And of course, we would be talking about what happened. And I think one of the things that was very hard for me and that lingers with me is that I kept talking about 9/11 and I kept processing this. One of the most difficult stories that I ever did was when the Port Authority released the paper transcripts of their operators from that day.
Here in the United States, the agency that managed the World Trade Center has released thousands of words to go with the images of September 11, 2001.
We picked up the records about 6 in the evening, and I was doing a story for NPR where I basically had to read just horrifying details and turn it into a story.
Authorities call this a record of heroism, though we want to warn you that it's also disturbing. Andrea Bernstein reports from member station WNYC.
The transcripts were made from a reel-to-reel recording rescued from the rubble of World Trade Center 5 in the weeks after the attacks.
The records of it were really tough stuff, talking about people not being able to get off the top floors and what should they do. And there was no tape, so it was all narration.
In one poignant series of calls, Christine Oleander, the assistant manager of Windows on the World, the restaurant on the 106th and 107th floors of Tower 1, calls the Port Authority police desk. We're getting no direction up here. We're having a smoke condition. We need direction as to where we need to direct our guests and employees. Port Authority police officer Stephen Magid. Okay, we're doing our best. We've got the fire department. Everybody, we're trying to get up to you. Call back in about 2 to 3 minutes, and I'll find out what direction you should try to get down.
I had this overwhelming sense of living in a horror movie when you want to say, get out of the higher floors, walk down. But some of the advice that people were being given was staying put because just nobody knew anything.
Port Authority police officer Ray Murray. We're sending people up there. Christine, what's your ETA? Murray, as soon as possible. As soon as humanly possible.
So that was certainly a difficult thing. Covering it over and over and over again was very difficult emotionally.
What do you think about every year when their anniversary rolls around?
Well, the first was definitely the worst. I think the first was the most visceral feeling. I remember the first anniversary well because there was this incredible wind and the dust that was stirred up. I mean, I just think it sort of was this physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil of the first anniversary. Certainly the anniversaries have gotten better, but I think there is never a moment when 9/11 happens, and I don't feel sad for the families, most of all, but also for the less innocent place that we've become.
How do you see September 11th, related to what you were saying, how do you see September 11th as having left its lasting mark on New York City and the collective memory of New Yorkers?
Well, I mean, it's always a huge question. I mean, we used to joke because we would put in every story about 9/11. I mean, it's kind of dark humor, but we used to joke, everything changed, and we put that in a story, but nothing was the same. But it's really true. The city changed, the openness, the policing, the access in and out of buildings, the sense of freedom of movement in the world. All of that constricted. I was sent inevitably after 9/11, after there was an incident anywhere in the world, in Madrid or London or any kind of bombing in a Western city mostly, and people would always say, go to a transit center and ask people how they feel. And people would always say the same thing, exactly the same thing. Like, what are you going to do? You got to live your life. So I think that there is a sense of life enduring in New York and people wanting to go on. And it's what makes it such a wonderful place to be. But I feel like for those of us who did live in New York before 9/11, it was a much more chaotic, rambunctious, and disorganized place, and sometimes in a good way and sometimes in a bad way. The lasting legacy of 9/11 is that we have a sense of vulnerability, but that we, in some ways, I think, feel more connected with the world because these things that can happen are not just things that happen in other places.
From the 9/11 Memorial Museum, this is Our City, Our Story. I'm Will Thwaites. I host and produce the series alongside Jenny Pachuki. This episode was also produced by Elizabeth Bistro and written by me, Will Thwaites. Our executive producers are Michael Frazier and Carl Cricco. Sound editing is done by Sam Behrens. If you want to hear more from Andrea Bernstein, she recently released a podcast series called Trump Inc. that explores the business dealings of President Donald Trump. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts, which is also where you can find us, Our City, Our Story. Our website is 911memorial.org.